Hello again, and welcome to the start of Unit 4. The final unit of the course focuses on art movements of the 20th century and takes us as close to 2020 as we can get. We're going to start off with movements associated with what we generally call Expressionism. We saw Expressionism in the art of Gauguin and Van Gogh most dramatically in the previous unit, and so tradition spills over into the beginning of the 20th century. We're going to start with looking at the work of the Fauves. Now, the name Fauve is your first vocab term. It comes from a negative criticism of their work in the yearly Salon of Autumn in 1905. One of the critics liked the sculptures but hated the paintings and described the show as if Donatello had been set among wild beasts. So fauve means wild beast. The idea is that they are breaking all kinds of rules about what art has been in the past, about what makes art good, that they're going further than the post-impressionists in their extreme use of color, and so they were considered very radical at the time. The leader of the movement is Matisse. We're going to focus on him pretty intensely here. So we have multiple exhibitions going on throughout the early of the century. You're used to the official salon being held by the academies in Europe. We now see reactions against the salon. Certainly saw exhibitions like the Salon des Refusés in Unit 3, but starting in 1903, with the support of Renoir, have the foundation of the Salon of Autumn, and then we also have the Salon of the Independents founded by Seurat. So these exhibitions actually do continue well into the 2000s, at least until the early 2000s. So we certainly have exhibitions of work that now is in opposition to what the official academic approach to art had been for centuries. We're now really seeing a massive change. So this is the kind of thing that the Fauve artists are known for, and it may not seem like the work of a wild beast to you, but if you think about art audiences being raised on the idea that everything has to look like what it's supposed to be, then a tree that starts off blue at the bottom and orange at the top seems completely insane. If you really look carefully, though, at this painting by Derain, you can see on the right-hand edge that here has obviously green leaves that are throwing a shadow onto that tree trunk, and suddenly his color choices, although they're extreme, do seem to make sense relative to the idea of trying to express light and shadow, albeit in a heightened emotional way. This is the work of another member of the Fauve, Maurice de Vlaminck, and again, you can see that it certainly has its roots in what the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were doing. There's very evident open brushwork, there's a reduction in the amount of specific detail, but I would say these artists really push even further toward giving us really powerful emotional experiences through color. For the test is Georges Rouault. Rouault's painting is very much informed by his early training. He originally started out working as an apprentice for a stained glass artist. So if you look at this painting in particular, the Old King has very rich color, very vibrant, as if light is coming through it, and then the areas of color are kind of blocked by black lines, kind of the way the leading would hold the pieces of glass in a window. We also have a artists in on this style because Matisse, although not running a true full-on academy, did start holding courses at his studio. He offered a kind of alternative to a formal academy training, and some American artists were among his students, including Arthur Carles, and this is one of his most remarkable and beautiful paintings in the Fauve manner. Matisse, I just wanted you to get a sense important he is, because really he and Picasso are your two biggest names, at least for the first half of the 20th century. They are the two leading, and quite frankly, they are rivals. They're sometimes in opposition to one another, but I wanted you to see how quickly Matisse's style, the early works of the early 1900s. The top left is a very early one that is more of an approach of realism, really quite quickly he breaks into pointillism, extremes of color, and develops the Fauve movement by the end of that decade. The 1910s, you can see an exploration here of flattening of form, more abstraction, certainly the reduction of specific detail. He's beginning to engage also with some of Picasso's ideas from the early days of Cubism. In the 1920s, Matisse returns to a little bit solidity, a little more specific reality. That figure of the odalisque on the chair in the center of your screen right now certainly has very accurately described foreshortening and the forearm, much more solidly painted than some of the earlier pieces. Then again, by the 30s, he goes flat again and starts pattern and texture and this extreme exaggeration in the abstraction. The work of the 40s pushes even a little bit further. The colors become less and less about observational reality. The patterns and textures begin to become really, really, truly extreme. By the 1950s, Matisse has suffered some ill health. He's also unable to stand for a long period of time at his easel, so he starts working with cut paper, cutting colored paper with and gluing pieces together. So he starts to paint and draw in a way with collage. So these are some early pieces. These are in the collection of Museum in St. Petersburg in Russia, and you can really see that it does have a tie to direct observation and to the work of both the real movement, but more specifically the Impressionist movement. These are early Matisse still lifes. He also, of course, does figure studies very much in a vein that shows his indebtedness to Paul Cézanne. And when you put a Cézanne painting beside it, knowing that Matisse bought this painting and owned it, kept it, then you can kind of see a connection between Cézanne's approach of rendering everything in nature as a sphere, a cone, or a cube in the approach that Matisse is taking here in 1900. These are some remarkable paintings of his from his early period that have incredible amount of color, but also give us a sense of a subject that he's going to return to again and again. In this painting of Notre Dame, we're actually inside a building looking out an open window, and that theme will come up for Matisse again and again and again. He definitely was supported by his wife. She was rather successful, actually, as essentially a designer of high-end, high-fashion women's hats, and that was what so he does several paintings of her. The one that gets him the most notoriety, though, is this one. This is sometimes referred to as Woman with Green Stripe, and it was in the exhibition of the Salon of Autumn 1905, and he actually was getting negative criticism about it, that he urged his wife please not to go to see the exhibition. He didn't want her to be exposed to the negative comments people were making about this piece in particular, how ugly it was. If you really look carefully, though, you can see that there's reflected color in her skin that clearly is coming background. The greens and blues in the skin makes sense in a way, but they are, of course, very heightened colors, far more richer than the kind of color play that you would see in an Impressionist painting. So this is one of those pieces that really became notorious in Matisse's early career. This painting would eventually be purchased by Gertrude and Leo Stein. They would hold work in their Paris apartments. They were expatriate Americans, avant-garde, kind of bohemian lifestyle who collected modern art and promoted modern art. So they were really leading this new charge of showcasing new and dangerous works. And obviously, intrigued by what Matisse was doing at this stage. Matisse often uses the theme of these figures dancing in a circle that you can see here. This is really their first appearance as early as 1905. But you can see him simplifying the human form, deleting and merging figures into backgrounds and into each other in this piece. We know that this was kind of a shock to the art world at the time that it was premiered, and Picasso responded this piece by painting his famous Demoiselle d'Avignon. It's kind of remarkable to see. This is a painting that shows scene, husband and wife, she's seated, immovable, he's standing, rigid, immovable, but the room around them has been suffused with this intense blue, kind of melancholy color, and again, you have that window opening onto the outside world. The harmony in red is a piece we want to know for the text. It also includes that same idea we just saw of the color of an object spreading beyond that object into the walls and surrounding space. The pattern that you see the tablecloth, but it also flows off the tablecloth and onto the back wall as if it's wallpaper. The window, unless it's a framed painting to the left, echoes some of the shapes that you see in other places, particularly the hairstyle of the woman arranging the fruit on the table. One of the things I love about what Matisse does is that he gives you something that feels like a solid reality, but with the least amount of detail that you could need in order to show what's going on. Notice the way it appears that the fabric folds over the table. You can kind of see where that table is, even though there isn't a line there to define it. Matisse uses that red color again here in the Red Studio, which is a piece I quite like because it really red is this passionate color, and he's painting his studio, which from photographs we know that the studios he worked in generally had white walls. So this isn't reality, it's his emotional take on reality. Where else would a painter have their most intense experiences but in their studio? He also traveled quite a bit and made art about and inspired by his travels. He went to Morocco quite famously, and these are paintings from that period. He also begins to kind of respond to Picasso's fracturing of shapes and forms, especially as he moves into the synthetic cubism that looks more like cut paper collage. This is sort of Matisse responding to some of Picasso's moves here in 1916. That comes up again and again. This one is the first version, 1909. The famous one is this one that is now in the collection of the Hermitage, Petersburg. One of the things that really moves me about this piece, it's quite large. It's over 8 feet in height. It's over 10 feet in width. Figures are both simplified, they're less detailed than one might expect, and also somewhat exaggerated. Some of those body positions would be a little hard to do physically, but the part that really moves me about the painting is this section right here between the figure at the far left and the figure at the bottom. Their hands are not quite touching. I've always thought that this painting seems to suggest not only that the figures are unified, but that one figure that seems to be leaning on such an extreme angle, almost as if she's falling, is being caught by the hand of this figure reaching back for her. There's kind of a symbolic story being told here in very simple terms. The painting, of course, is orange and blue primarily, and those are complementary colors. They intensify one another. Side. Having seen this in person, it absolutely has a feeling of dynamic movement because of that extreme contrast of color. So it's an interesting thing that he's able to achieve both simplicity and intensity and move you on an emotional level. We know that the painting was originally for a dining room. One of his collectors, who was a wealthy Russian, wanted the most modern art in the world, and he specifically commissioned this piece, and then when he saw it in process got so shocked that he actually kind of chickened out and decided he was not going to purchase the painting. He turned to another artist and offered the commission. Matisse even stepped in and allowed his replacement to use the studio because it was the only space quite large enough. And on the train ride home, his collector realized what a mistake he'd made. Stopped the train so he could send word back to Matisse that he was wrong. He apologized. Please finish. So Matisse actually creates 2 pieces for that dining room, and this is the second piece. The piece is music. So again, you get the feeling of sound and movement both in these incredibly intense images. You can only this would have been to the dinner guests coming in to sit down in a wealthy aristocratic home and see art that feels like it's come really from the future. Matisse also was very interested in the ideas of what photography could do to help what painting was about. So he started photographing his work at the end of major changes. At the end of each major work session, he would photographic record, and then had an exhibition where he showed the black and white photographs, which you see here, leading up to the final piece that you see at the bottom right. So this piece was WIP means their work in progress. These are his progress photographs over the course of 5 months. So you can see how dramatically changes as elements are added in, removed, altered, and you can see him going from something that has more quote-unquote naturalism or quote-unquote realism to something that becomes by the end very abstract. Now Matisse quite often has been criticized for these images looking really simple. This, after all, seconds to make some exaggerated contours of a female body. But if you know it took him 5 months to arrive at that level of simplicity, it really changes your opinion about what it is that he's doing. He does the same thing in sculpture that he does in painting. Here's a series he worked on in between, but from 1909 to the last one being finished in 1930, it's all the same image, the same pose, female back, more believable, more naturalistic, becoming more abstract with the second step in 1913, far more abstract by the third version, almost completely unrecognizable in its abstraction by 1930. So if you just saw this last one, you might think, wow, can't draw or paint, he doesn't know what he's doing. When you see the entire sequence, though, you can see what he's doing is really evolving and changing, editing the image to arrive at this level of abstraction. He also received some commissions that Picasso was pretty jealous of. It was rather unusual for an artist to get a commission to do decorations for a church any longer. Certainly, we haven't really seen a lot of that since the Baroque, and here is a commission Matisse was given to decorate the walls, create the designs for the fabric for the robes of the priest and the altar covering and the glass window. All of these are made possible because of the friendship that he struck up with the nun who was one of the nurses through some of his final health difficulties near the end of his life. There he is using his scissors to cut paper to create the images that were eventually published. There are a couple of books, one The Circus and one Jazz, which was published in 1947. This is the final piece. Matisse was working on completing the design for this window up until really just before he died. He finished work on this 2 days before death. So we know that Matisse was adamant about continuing to work even under extreme circumstances. This piece, photograph, reminds me all it is to work on your goals and to work in the way that is honest to you, no matter what the circumstance. By 1941, Matisse has been diagnosed with duodenal cancer, and he has a period after the surgery where he problems as a result, so he was quite often bedridden. Here's the man drawing with a 6 to 8 foot piece of bamboo with a piece of charcoal to be able to continue to work. He's unable to stand, he has gastric problems, he's unable to see terribly well, and he's creating some of the most lively and exciting work of his entire life toward the end. So really, Matisse for me is a symbol of never giving up. Certainly have given us this kind of feeling about the intensity of emotion. We certainly saw that with The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh, and I thought it was important to think about how artists think about their work. These are Van Gogh's words. The emotions are sometimes so strong that I work without knowing it. The strokes. Picasso said, a work of art which did not begin in emotion is not art. And Matisse, I do not literally paint the table, but the emotion it produces within me. They're all talking about the same thing. It is not reality. The images they're making wouldn't fit a painter's goals, but they fit into emotional reality, and that's really, I think, what's most important about what they're doing. Whether it's joy on the left with Matisse or sorrow on the right with Picasso, the intense emotional honesty, I think, is what makes them so important to us. Now, separately, but I just wanted to run down a couple of things about them that are the same. They rejected the academies, leaders of 20th century movements, the same clients. They both acknowledged that Cézanne was a huge influence on them. They definitely leaned more toward abstraction. But Matisse started painting much earlier than Picasso. He was in his 20s. Picasso was a child prodigy. They had different styles, very much. Fauve style, more about color, cubism, more about design, more about visual elements of line and shape. Matisse's style doesn't change as Picasso's, although there are changes. Matisse had a little bit more stable and quiet life and personality. Picasso had multiple children by different women. There's definitely also a lack of political commentary in Matisse's work. We find more direct references to world events in the work of Picasso. We know that they exchanged work. These are paintings that they traded with one another. So we know that they were communication and in exchange of ideas, even though they were really pretty bitter rivals. We also know that Picasso continued to buy paintings from other dealers, although Matisse never bought a Picasso. He would accept them as gifts, and he was fascinated, which is really a beautiful Picasso painting, quite disturbing one as well. We also know that they kind of fought over their clients. So the paintings on the left are the ones that were purchased by Gertrude and Leo Stein. On the right, Picasso, having been invited to Salon at home, saw the paintings of Matisse and decided he was going to try to kind of create a rivalry there. He, instead of trying to get them to pay for a painting, he flat out offered to paint a portrait of Gertrude Stein as a gift so that he could get his work into their collection. And they had paintings in their home in the same room. If you can imagine this kind of conflict or contrast between these two geniuses sort of battling it out in the realm of portraiture. You also see that Picasso is sort of using some of the poses. If you see these uplifted arms are somewhat similar to the poses that Matisse is using. As Picasso goes further into these kind of abstract cubist ways, you can see Matisse kind of answering those same issues in the solidity of his forms and these mysterious stories that he tells. When they become more flat, more interested in texture, they exchange ideas. There patterned painting by Matisse from 1911 and the beginnings of synthetic cubism, a collage by Picasso from 1912. We definitely know that they kind of spurred each other on, even though they had respect for one another. There was also some jealousy there. Matisse, this painting on the left, his painting of Goldfish, had led Picasso to create his piece on the right. So there's definitely of who is more important egoism going on between the two of them. Definitely, as they try each other's styles, this is a Matisse painting. But as Matisse changes over to more solid forms, Picasso does the same thing. So you can kind of see these two and these two related to one another, kind of answering each other, call and response. We know that Picasso was kind of shocked by the solo show that had the photographs in it. A Picasso painting that actually feels more like Matisse's language. We know that these are very, very closely related in time. Intent. We also know that as Matisse claims this flat territory, Picasso is going to reject it and go back to his fracturing and cubist approach.